You want to know when I decided to destroy my husband's life? It was the moment he told me his ex was his +1 to my own family's wedding, and that if I truly loved him, I would understand. He assumed I would cry or argue or eventually just accept it. And I did accept it. I accepted it with a quiet nod, because in that moment, I realized my revenge wouldn't come from a fight he could win, but from a quiet, simple promise I made to myself that his ex wouldn't be the only surprise +1 at that dinner. The crime, as it were, was not committed in a dark alley with a knife. It was committed in the sun-drenched, marble-floored living room of our mansion, a space so vast and sterile you could perform surgery on the coffee table. It was a room designed for comfort that was suddenly rendered a cold, sterile courtroom. He was leaning against the mantelpiece, swirling a 25-year-old single malt in a glass that cost more than my first car. He was the very picture of casual command, a king surveying a kingdom he believed he had built and owned in its entirety. "By the way," he began. Those were always his favorite words, 4 simple syllables that served as the velvet glove over the iron fist of his intentions. "By the way" was never a prelude to a conversation. It was the announcement of a verdict that had already been reached in the Supreme Court of his own mind. It was the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head, a casual dismissal before the decree. "I told Chloe she could come to your brother's wedding. She'll be my +1. The words didn't just hang in the air. They sucked the oxygen out of it. My world didn't just tilt, it sheared off its axis. It wasn't the simple gall of the statement, the sheer, unmitigated audacity of it. It was the setting. My brother's wedding. An event that was supposed to be a cornerstone of my family, a celebration of a love I still believed in, even if my own had become a hollowed-out facade. He had taken something that was foundationally mine and declared it his territory. The immediate consequence, the feeling that washed over me in that terrible, silent moment, was one of profound erasure. He had taken a fine point pen and drawn a neat, clean line through my name, through my role. I wasn't his wife. I wasn't the sister of the groom. I wasn't even a participant. I was a logistical hurdle to be overcome, a minor detail in the grand tapestry of his desires. I remember the way the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to grow brighter, harsher. I could see the individual dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, each one a tiny, insignificant particle, just like me. He measures his worth by the size of his portfolio and the envy in other men's eyes. He sees the world not as a network of relationships, but as a series of assets to be managed and controlled, and his wife Jessica is chief among them. He believed he acquired me, and my compliance was a dividend he was owed. For years I had absorbed the paper cuts to my dignity, with a quiet, observant patience, filing them away. I was not a victim. I was an intelligence operative in my own home, gathering data on the slow erosion of our partnership. This wasn't a paper cut. This was a severing. When I finally found my voice, it was a ghost in my own throat. "Richard, that's incredibly inappropriate. It's my brother's wedding." He didn't even have the decency to look conflicted. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the epitome of unbothered. This is when he deployed his primary weapon, the one he had honed to a razor's edge over years of corporate negotiations and marital disputes: manipulative gaslighting. "She's basically family," he said. The lie so audacious, so breathtaking in its dishonesty. It was almost a work of art. Chloe, the woman he dated for 5 years before me, the woman whose name was a forbidden word in our first year of marriage until he decided, unilaterally, that it wasn't. The woman he claimed was now just a dear friend. A piece of his past he wanted to possess concurrently with his present. Like a collector who refuses to put any of his trophies into storage, then came the master stroke. The loyalty test. The emotional blackmail dressed up in the noble costume of maturity. He looked at me, his eyes holding that familiar, condescending warmth. "If you trust me, you'll get it." What I lost in that instant was the last lingering illusion of our partnership. I finally saw with perfect, chilling clarity that our marriage wasn't a partnership at all. It was a benevolent dictatorship, and my role was simply to be a grateful and agreeable citizen. He had used the language of love, trust, to inflict a wound of profound disrespect, assuming I would simply absorb it as I had all the others. He was so convinced of his own infallibility, so blinded by the brilliant glare of his own ego that he couldn't see the difference between a wife and a doormat. He didn't realize he wasn't just making a demand. He was signing his own social death warrant. The hurt was real, a flash of searing, white-hot pain. But then something else took its place, a feeling so cold and so clear it was almost serene. The years of quiet observation transformed into a blueprint for war. I looked at him, standing there by the fireplace, so smug, so certain of his victory. And I made a decision. I would not give him the fight he wanted, the fight he was equipped to win. He expected hysterics, jealousy, tears. He was an expert at navigating those waters, at making me the unreasonable one. No, I would give him exactly what he asked for. I let a small, tight smile touch my lips. Of course I do, I said, my voice as smooth as the scotch in his glass. I trust you. I trust you. Let him think it's submission. Let him savor this victory. Every ounce of his arrogance is a stone I will use to build his tomb. He wants me to trust him? I will. I will trust him to be exactly the fool he is. The system of justice that had failed in that moment was the unspoken contract of our marriage. There was no higher court to appeal to. Confronting him directly was a strategic dead end. He had already built a fortress of arrogance around himself, and the walls were soundproofed against my reason. Our friends? They operate on a currency of image and superficial harmony. Voicing my grievance would be a breach of protocol, an airing of dirty laundry that would reflect poorly on me. I would be the difficult wife, the unaccommodating one. The system of high society etiquette, designed to ensure civility, would instead protect the transgressor and punish the victim for speaking out. No. Since no legitimate channel for justice existed, I was left with only one option: to become the judge, jury, and executioner myself, using the only rules Richard truly understood, the rules of power, image, and public humiliation. My first move had to be one of flawless compliance. The mask had to be fitted and sealed, with no cracks to betray the fury simmering beneath. The very next morning, I went to my study, my sanctuary, my office, the one room in the house that was truly mine, and I made the call. My brother David answered on the second ring, his voice buzzing with the happy chaos of last-minute wedding preparations. Jess! Hey! Everything okay? Everything's perfect, I said, forcing a warmth into my voice that felt like swallowing glass. I was just calling about the seating chart for the rehearsal dinner. I know it's a nightmare, just wanted to finalize our little corner of it. We chatted for a few minutes about flower arrangements and his fiancée's dress. The mundane details felt surreal, a conversation from a life I no longer lived. I could hear the smile in his voice, the pure, uncomplicated joy. And I felt a pang of guilt, a sharp stab of sorrow that I was about to use his beautiful moment as a battlefield. But Richard had made that choice, not me. I was simply choosing the terms of engagement. Oh, and David, I added, my tone as casual as if I were mentioning the weather. One small thing. Richard is bringing a +1, an old friend named Chloe. We'll need a seat for her. There was a brief pause on his end. Chloe, the Chloe. The very one, I said, my voice impossibly light. It's a long story, but they're just friends now. You know, Richard, he's terrible at saying no. I let out a little tinkling laugh, a sound I had perfected over years of charity galas and strained dinner parties. It was the laugh of the agreeable wife, the one who smooths over her husband's occasional crudeness. Okay, Jess. If you're okay with it, then it's fine by me. We'll make it work. I'm perfectly fine with it, I lied. Thanks, sweetie. I'll see you tomorrow. I ended the call and set the phone down on the polished mahogany of my desk. My hand was steady. My breathing was even. My voice doesn't even shake. Years of hosting dinner parties for people I despise has been excellent training. My own brother. I'm lying to my own brother to set this stage. The cost is already mounting, but a war is not won without sacrifice. That night, I waited until I heard the heavy, rhythmic sound of Richard's breathing from the master bedroom. He always fell asleep instantly, the sleep of a man with no conscience. I slipped out of bed, put on a silk robe, and went back to my study. In the dark, the only light came from the cool silver glow of my laptop as it powered on. The investigation began. This was not a world I was unfamiliar with. The wealthy do not hide behind privacy settings. They broadcast their lives, curating an existence for public consumption. Chloe was no different. Her social media was a gallery of expensive vacations, flattering selfies, and saccharine captions about living her best life. It was easy, too easy. I needed more than her brunch photos. I have over the years cultivated an extensive network. Not Richard's network of boorish business partners and backslapping politicians, but a quieter, more subtle web of connections. The wives, the assistants, the people who, like me, see everything and say nothing. It didn't take long. A few discreet messages, a quick search on a private database I have access to for my charity board work. And there it was. The key, the fulcrum upon which my entire plan would pivot, the detail that Richard, in his boundless arrogance, had either neglected to discover, or more likely, failed to mention. Chloe wasn't just Chloe Collins anymore. She was Chloe Collins Sharma, married, for the last 3 years, to a man named Mark Sharma, a partner at a boutique architectural firm. A man who, from the look of his professional profile, was quiet, serious, and not in our social circle. Perfect. There it is. The lever to move the world. He didn't even bother to mention this. Does he not know, or does he simply not care? It doesn't matter. The game is not chess anymore. It's an autopsy, and I have my first incision point. The board is set. The next step required precision. It couldn't come from me. It had to feel like serendipity, like an act of a benevolent universe rewarding a man for his hard work. I spent an hour crafting the instrument of his downfall. First, I created a new email address, something bland and corporate. events.coordination.nysagmail.com, untraceable, forgettable. Then I wrote the email to Mark Sharma. Dear Mr. Sharma, I typed. My name is Catherine Pierce. I am an event coordinator with Metropolitan Design and Living magazine. We are currently developing a surprise feature for our winter issue titled The New Architects, Shaping the Future of the City, and your name has been put forward by our editorial board as a potential candidate. We would like to arrange a brief, informal preliminary meeting to discuss the feature and your potential inclusion. I will be in your area for a wedding at the Park Hyatt this Friday evening and was hoping you might be available to meet at the hotel bar, the living room, around 7:30 p.m. for a quick drink. Please let me know if this time is convenient for you. Sincerely, Catherine Pierce. The bait had to be irresistible to his ego, not his greed. Architects, in my experience, are a proud species. The promise of a feature in a prestigious magazine, framed as a surprise honor, was a lure he could not ignore. It had to feel like fate, a professional opportunity he couldn't pass up. I read it over a dozen times, tweaking a word here, adjusting the punctuation there. It was a perfect little machine, designed for a single purpose. I clicked send. He will walk into that room of his own free will, a willing pawn in a game he doesn't know he's playing. Richard thinks power is his money, his booming laugh. He's wrong. True power is knowledge, patiently gathered and ruthlessly applied. I didn't have to wait long. The next afternoon, as I was arranging flowers in the vast empty foyer, my phone chimed with a notification. It was a new email to the Catherine Pierce account. It was from Mark. He was, as I predicted, both honored and delighted. 7:30 p.m. on Friday would be, in his words, absolutely perfect. I closed the email. I locked the phone. And then I went back to my laptop, opened it, and deleted the entire email account. Catherine Pierce had served her purpose. She vanished into the ether as quickly as she had been born. I closed my laptop, and the sound of it snapping shut echoed in the silent room. The sound of finality. The trap is set. The trigger is armed. All I have to do now is survive the wait, and pretend to be the woman my husband thinks I am for another 48 hours. The last act of preparation was personal. It was the evening of the rehearsal dinner. Richard was in his study, taking a loud, self-important business call. I was in my walk-in closet, a room the size of a studio apartment, surrounded by the armor of my life. Racks of designer dresses, shelves of expensive shoes, drawers of silk and cashmere, a curated collection of the woman I was supposed to be. I had 2 options laid out for the evening. One was a soft rose gold sheath dress. It was elegant, understated, the dress of a supportive wife, a gracious hostess, the dress of the woman everyone in that room expected me to be. The other was black. A stunning, severe column of silk that fell to the floor. It had sharp shoulders and a neckline that was both modest and menacing. It was not the dress of a wife. It was the dress of a widow. My hand hovered over the rose gold for a moment. A flicker of the old Jessica, the peacemaker, the smoother of surfaces. Then I decisively took the black dress from its hanger. Tonight is a funeral, the death of a marriage, the death of the woman who would have worn the other dress. I should dress for the occasion. As I zipped it up, the cold silk against my skin felt like a promise. The mask was in place. The stage was set. The actors were all about to make their entrances. And I, the director, was ready for the curtain to rise. It's a funny thing, the tipping point. For years you absorb the small slights, the tiny betrayals, the paper cuts to your soul. You tell yourself it's marriage, it's compromise, it's just the way things are. You become a master of absorption, a connoisseur of quiet dignity. And then one day, they push a little too far. They miscalculate. My husband, Richard, made that miscalculation when he decided to bring his ex-girlfriend, Chloe, as his date to my own brother's wedding. He didn't just invite a guest. He declared my irrelevance. He thought his announcement was the end of a conversation, but it was the beginning of his end. The last 48 hours have been a masterclass in deception. I smiled. I agreed. I made the necessary calls. I became the perfect, understanding wife he always believed me to be. But behind that mask, I was assembling a weapon. I discovered his little secret, that Chloe is married, and I used that knowledge to set a trap. Tonight is the rehearsal dinner. Richard thinks he's walking into a celebration where he's the king, flanked by his wife and his mistress. He thinks he's won. But he's not walking into a party. He's walking into an ambush I've meticulously designed, and the guest of honor, Chloe's unsuspecting husband, is already on his way. The curtain is about to go up on the first act of Richard's public demolition. The Park Hyatt is a temple of understated wealth. The air itself feels expensive, filtered and scented with something vaguely floral and entirely artificial. As we stepped out of the chauffeured car, the doorman greeted Richard by name, a small act of deference that always made his shoulders straighten just a little. He placed a proprietary hand on the small of my back, guiding me through the revolving doors. To any observer, we were the perfect couple, powerful, elegant, a united front. The black dress felt like a second skin, a layer of darkness that matched the one coiled inside me. The rehearsal dinner was in a private room on the second floor. As we ascended the grand staircase, I could hear the low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the sound of my own social circle, people I had known for years, people whose lives were as carefully constructed as my own. Every one of them was a potential juror in the trial that was about to take place. Richard, of course, was in his element. He thrives in these environments. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who has never had to doubt his own importance. He clapped men on the back, kissed women on the cheek, his voice a low, confident boom that cut through the chatter. I trailed in his wake, smiling my serene, perfect smile, accepting compliments on my dress, making the appropriate small talk. Look at him, the conquering hero. He has no idea he's walking on a floor of ice so thin it's about to crack under the weight of his own ego. Every smile he gives, every handshake, is an act in a play whose tragic ending has already been written. And then I saw her. Chloe was standing near the bar, holding a glass of champagne. She was exactly as I remembered from the few times Richard had insisted we all have a civilized dinner together. Blonde, tanned, with a laugh that was just a little too loud, she was wearing a red dress, a bold, declarative statement in a room of muted charcoals and navies. She was a splash of gasoline waiting for a match. She saw us, and her face lit up with a smile that was pure, predatory triumph. She glided towards us, ignoring me completely, her eyes fixed on Richard. "Richie!" she exclaimed, kissing him on both cheeks. "You made it. I was starting to think you'd stood me up." "Never," Richard said, his hand lingering on her arm just a second too long. "You look incredible, Chloe." "You clean up okay yourself," she purred. Then, and only then, did she turn her gaze to me. Her eyes raked over my black dress, a flicker of something, disdain? Amusement? In their depths. "Jessica," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "So good of you to be so understanding about all this. Of course, I said, my voice even and cool. Anything to make Richard happy. Anything. The barb, subtle as it was, sailed right over Richard's head. He beamed, basking in the glow of having his two prized possessions in the same room, seemingly coexisting in perfect harmony. He was a child who had been allowed to bring all his favorite toys to a party. The next hour was a blur of forced pleasantries. I watched Richard and Chloe from a distance, a small fixed smile on my face. They were inseparable, a magnetic field of their own history pulling them together. They stood too close, laughed too loud. He would whisper something in her ear, and she would throw her head back and laugh, her hand flying to his chest. It was a performance, a flagrant and deliberate display of their connection, and it was all for my benefit. Every shared glance, every private joke, was a little dagger aimed at me. They think they're being subtle. They think this is their private little rebellion, a secret they're sharing in plain sight. They don't realize they're just actors on my stage, playing their parts to perfection. Every gesture of disrespect is another nail in his coffin. Let them gloat. The higher they climb, the harder they will fall. I circulated, playing my own part. I spoke to my parents, who looked at the scene with a mixture of confusion and concern. I reassured my brother that everything was fine, that it was a modern situation, and not to worry. I was the very picture of grace under pressure. But beneath the surface, I was a coiled spring, a predator watching its prey wander ever closer to the snare. I kept a discreet eye on the entrance to the room and on the clock. 7:25 p.m., 5 minutes. I excused myself and made my way to the bar, ordering a club soda with lime. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the doorway. Richard and Chloe were now sitting at a small table with another couple, their heads bent close together, deep in conversation. He had his arm draped casually over the back of her chair. 28 p.m. My heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was the moment of truth. The point of no return. If Mark Sharma didn't show, my plan would collapse. It would be nothing but an empty gesture, a failed gambit. And then, at precisely 7:30 p.m., a man walked into the room. He was tall, with dark hair and a serious, intelligent face. He was wearing a well-tailored suit and looked slightly lost, as if he had wandered into the wrong party. He scanned the room, his eyes searching. It was Mark Sharma. He matched the photo from his company's website perfectly. My bait had been taken. My ghost, Catherine Pierce, had delivered. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink. I let him stand there for a full minute, a solitary island of confusion in a sea of celebratory chatter. I wanted him to feel the full awkwardness of the moment. Then, with the calm, purposeful air of a gracious hostess, I began to walk towards him. "You look a little lost," I said, my voice warm and welcoming. "Can I help you find someone?" He turned, a look of relief on his face. "Thank you. Yes, I'm looking for a Catherine Pierce. I have a meeting with her." I said, a small, sympathetic frown on my face. "I'm afraid I don't know a Catherine Pierce. Perhaps she's running late." I glanced around the room theatrically. "This is a private party, a wedding rehearsal. It's possible there's been a mistake with the location." His face fell. "Oh, I see. My apologies for intruding." He looked flustered, embarrassed. "It's no intrusion at all," I said smoothly. "I'm Jessica. The groom is my brother." I extended a hand. He shook it, his grip firm. "Mark Sharma. A pleasure to meet you. And again, my apologies. Please don't worry about it," I said. "Since you're here, why don't you let me get you a drink? The bar is right over there." I steered him gently towards the bar, away from the entrance, and deeper into the heart of the room. The pawn is on the board. Now, to move him into position, he must not leave. He must be here when the curtain falls. I made small talk with him, asking about his work, feigning interest in a new project his firm was designing. He was polite, articulate, and clearly uncomfortable. He was a man who belonged in a library or a design studio, not in this den of sharks. After a few minutes, I saw my opportunity. "You know," I said, as if the thought had just occurred to me, "it's a small world. My husband Richard is a huge admirer of modern architecture. He would be fascinated to hear about your work. Let me introduce you." Before he could protest, I was guiding him through the crowd, a gentle but firm hand on his elbow. I could see Richard and Chloe still at their table, still lost in their own world. They didn't see us coming. We were 10 feet away. 5 feet. "Richard, darling," I said, my voice clear and bright, cutting through their private conversation. Richard looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at the interruption, and then he saw Mark. His smile froze on his face. His eyes darted from Mark to me and then, with a dawning horror, to Chloe. Chloe followed his gaze. When she saw her husband standing next to me, all the color drained from her face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. The silence at the table was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The cheerful chatter of the party seemed to fade into a distant buzz. "Richard, Chloe," I said, my smile never wavering. "I wanted to introduce you to someone. This is Mark Sharma. Mark, this is my husband, Richard. And this is his +1, Chloe Collins Sharma." I made sure to put a slight, deliberate emphasis on her last name. Mark's eyes widened in confusion. He looked at Chloe, then at Richard, then back at his wife. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture of breathtaking ugliness. "Chloe," he said, his voice a strangled whisper. "What are you doing here?" Chloe just stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. No sound came out. Richard, ever the deal-maker, was the first to recover. He tried to bluff his way out, to control the narrative. He stood up, extending a hand to Mark, his voice a forced, hearty boom. "Mark! Good to see you. Chloe was just telling me you were in the neighborhood. Small world?" Mark didn't take his hand. He just stared at Richard, his expression hardening from confusion to a cold, clear fury. "You're Richard," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The old friend from work she's been having dinner with." The air crackled. The couple sitting with Richard and Chloe were now staring, wide-eyed, sensing the drama unfolding. People at the nearby tables were beginning to notice the frozen tableau, the palpable tension. I took a small step back, a silent, impartial observer. My work was done. I had lit the fuse. Now all I had to do was watch the explosion. And there it is, the beautiful, terrible silence before the storm, the moment when the lies run out of road. He thought he was in control. He thought he was the master of his universe. But his universe was just a house of cards, and all it took was one small, inconvenient truth to bring it all crashing down. Chloe finally found her voice. "Mark, it's not what you think," she stammered, her eyes pleading with her husband. "Isn't it?" He shot back, his voice rising. "You told me you were at a conference in Boston. You're here at a wedding rehearsal with him." He gestured at Richard, his hand trembling with rage. Richard tried to intervene again, to play the role of the calm, reasonable adult. "Now let's all just calm down. You stay out of this," Mark snarled, turning his fury on Richard. The polite architect was gone, replaced by a man who had been pushed past his limit. The room was growing quiet now. The ripples of the confrontation were spreading outwards. My brother, David, was looking over, a deep frown on his face. My parents were frozen in place. "So this is what you've been doing?" Mark said, his voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and rage. "Lying to me. For him? He's just a friend," Chloe insisted, tears starting to stream down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "A friend you bring as your date to a wedding party while you lie to your husband about being in another state." Mark's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. "How stupid do you think I am? How stupid do you both think I am?" He turned his glare back to Richard, who for the first time in his life looked completely and utterly powerless. Richard, the man who always had a plan, a contingency, an escape route, was trapped. "And you," Mark said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You bring another man's wife as your date? What kind of man does that?" Before Richard could answer, Mark did something I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't a man of words. He was a man of action. He picked up the half-full glass of champagne from the table in front of Chloe and, with a swift, clean motion, threw its contents directly into Richard's face. There was a collective gasp from the room. Richard stood there dripping, stunned into silence. The golden liquid ran down his face, soaking the front of his ridiculously expensive suit. He looked pathetic, small. Mark turned, gave Chloe one last look of utter disgust, and then pushed his way through the stunned crowd and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe was openly sobbing now, a mess of mascara and humiliation. Richard was still standing there, frozen, with champagne dripping from his chin, and I just watched. My brother David rushed over to me. "Jess, are you okay? What the hell is going on?" I turned to him, my expression one of perfect, concerned innocence. "I have no idea," I said, my voice trembling slightly for effect. "Richard just said he was bringing an old friend. I had no idea she was married. This is a nightmare." I allowed a single perfect tear to trace a path down my cheek. I was the victim here, the wronged wife, publicly humiliated by her husband's recklessness. The narrative was set. The jurors had reached their verdict. The party was over. The wedding weekend had been irrevocably tainted, and Richard's carefully constructed world of power and respect had been shattered in the most public and humiliating way possible. It's even better than I imagined. The beautiful, exquisite symphony of his destruction. He wanted to erase me, to make me invisible. But now he's the one everyone is staring at. He's the fool. He's the punchline. And I am the one holding the conductor's baton. Richard finally moved. He took out a silk pocket square and began to dab uselessly at his face. He wouldn't look at me. He couldn't. He mumbled something to Chloe, a pathetic attempt at comfort, and then he turned and walked towards the exit, his head held low. He didn't say a word to me. He just left. Chloe, left alone at the table, a pariah in a room full of strangers, gathered what was left of her dignity, and fled after him. I was left standing in the ruins. My family and friends started to close in around me, offering comfort, expressing their outrage on my behalf. I accepted their sympathy with grace, playing the part of the wounded but stoic wife to perfection. But inside, I was calm. I felt a cold, clean sense of victory. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The public humiliation was step one. There were still so many more stones to turn. So many more pillars of his life to bring crashing down. Later that night, back in the silent, empty mansion, he finally spoke to me. He came into my study, his face pale, his eyes full of a rage he couldn't direct at its true source, himself. So he directed it at me. "You knew," he said, his voice a low growl. "You knew she was married. You set this whole thing up." I looked up from the book I was pretending to read, my expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "You're the one who brought another man's wife to my brother's wedding. You're the one who lied. All I did was introduce two people. Don't play dumb with me, Jessica," he roared, taking a step towards me. For a second, I thought he might get violent, but that wasn't his style. His weapons were words, manipulation, control, and he had lost control. "The only person playing dumb here is you, Richard," I said, closing my book softly. "Did you really think there would be no consequences? Did you think you could just disrespect me, my family, and your own marriage vows without any repercussions? This isn't over," he snarled, his face contorted with a fury that was as impotent as it was ugly. I smiled, a real smile this time. A smile of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "Oh, Richard, you're right," I said. "We're just getting started." The explosion was as satisfying as it was predictable. When you build your life on a foundation of lies, it doesn't take a stick of dynamite to bring it down. A single well-placed pinprick will do. My pinprick was a man named Mark Sharma, the inconveniently existing husband of my husband's mistress. I didn't cause the scene at my brother's rehearsal dinner. I merely set the stage and arranged the lighting. Richard did the rest. He and Chloe, in their arrogance, walked right into the snare I had laid, their smug little world collapsing around them in a glorious spray of expensive champagne and public humiliation. Seeing the look on Richard's face, that rare, beautiful expression of a man who has completely lost control, was a victory. But it was only a single battle. He saw it as the peak of my retaliation, a desperate emotional lashing out. He was wrong. The party wasn't the end. It was a declaration of war, a public spectacle to ensure everyone knew who the villain was. Now that the world sees him for the fool he is, the real work can begin. The true revenge was never about a single evening. It's about systematically dismantling the two things he truly loves, his reputation and his money. The demolition of his social life was just the overture. Now it's time for the symphony. The wedding itself was a funereal affair. The air was thick with the unspoken. Richard and I moved through the day like two magnets repelling each other, a pocket of cold silence in every room we entered. He was a ghost at the feast, his face a mask of barely suppressed rage. He thought the worst was over. He believed he could weather the social storm, that the whispers would eventually die down, and his world would reset. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game we were now playing. He thought it was about pride. I knew it was about annihilation. The day after the wedding, while he nursed his wounded ego, I went to my study and initiated the second phase. The public humiliation was the visceral, emotional part of my revenge. The financial destruction would be the cold, intellectual masterpiece. For years I had been more than just his wife. I was his confidant, his unofficial advisor. I sat through countless dinners with his business partners, listening to their drunken boasts and their careless talk. I read the documents he left on his desk. I paid attention. He saw a decorative wife. He never realized he was living with a corporate spy. He once told me, laughing, that I had a mind for details he could never be bothered with. He meant it as a compliment to his own grand, visionary thinking. He never realized that his empire, his grand vision, was built on a foundation of those very details, and I had the blueprints. Richard's company, a private equity firm called Sterling Ventures, was his entire identity. It wasn't just a business. It was the physical manifestation of his ego, and its most valuable asset was a portfolio of tech startups he had acquired, one of which was a company called Innovate Dynamics. It was his crown jewel, the company he was planning to take public in the next 6 months, a move that would elevate him from a mere millionaire to something far more formidable. He had poured everything into it, and he had cut corners. My first target was his right-hand man, a perpetually nervous, ferociously ambitious man named Arthur Vance. Arthur was the COO of Sterling Ventures, the man who handled the details. He was also a man drowning in debt, a fact I discovered through a discreet inquiry with a private investigator I've had on retainer for years. For my charity work, vetting donors is a surprisingly dirty business. Arthur had a gambling problem and a lifestyle that far outstripped his generous salary. He was a man under immense pressure, a man ready to break. I didn't need to threaten him. I needed to offer him a lifeline that looked like an opportunity. Using a burner phone and a voice modulator, a delightful little gadget, I'd purchased online for this very purpose. I called Arthur on his private line. "Mr. Vance," the distorted voice said, "I represent a consortium of investors with a keen interest in the upcoming Innovate Dynamics IPO. We have reason to believe there are certain irregularities in the company's pre-IPO filings, specifically regarding the reporting of user acquisition costs and projected revenue streams." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the sweat beating on his forehead. "I don't know who this is, but I have no idea what you're talking about," he finally managed, his voice tight with panic. "I think you do. Mr. Vance?" I continued, the modulated voice calm and steady. "I think you know that Richard Sterling has been creatively recategorizing marketing expenses as capital investments to inflate the company's profitability. A clever, but highly illegal accounting trick. The kind of thing the SEC takes a very keen interest in." I let that hang in the air. I had found the documents confirming this in Richard's home safe months ago. I had photographed them and returned them. A little insurance policy for a rainy day. And now the storm had arrived. "What do you want?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Cooperation," I said. "A discrete package of documents. Everything you have on the Innovate Dynamics accounting, emailed to an anonymous address I will provide. In return for your cooperation, not only will your name be kept out of the inevitable investigation, but a sum of $250,000 will be deposited into an offshore account of your choosing. A consultancy fee, shall we say." He was quiet for a long time. I knew what he was thinking, weighing his loyalty to a man he feared against the ruin of his own life. "How do I know I can trust you?" he asked. "You don't," I replied. "But you know you can't trust Richard Sterling to protect you when this all comes crashing down. He will sacrifice you without a second thought to save himself. You know that better than anyone. I gave him the email address and a deadline of 24 hours. Then I hung up. The files arrived 17 hours later. Everything I needed. Memos, internal emails, falsified spreadsheets. Arthur had saved his own skin. The next step was to deliver the weapon into the right hands. I couldn't just leak it to the press. That was too messy, too unpredictable. This required a surgical strike. I had the information sent not to a journalist, but to a rival, a man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a ruthless vulture capitalist whom Richard had publicly humiliated a year prior by poaching a key deal at the last minute. Marcus was a man who held a grudge. He was also a man with deep connections at the Wall Street Journal and on several congressional oversight committees. He wouldn't just leak the information. He would use it like a scalpel to carve Richard's empire apart. I had the package delivered to Marcus's office by a secure courier, with a simple anonymous note attached. Then, I waited. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The silence was unnerving. Richard was a coiled snake, sullen and silent in the house. He was spending long hours at the office, trying to do damage control from the wedding fiasco. He was trying to mend fences, reassert his dominance. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet was about to open up. The bomb dropped on a Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen, drinking a cup of tea, when my phone buzzed with a news alert from the Wall Street Journal. The headline was stark. Sterling Ventures faces. SEC probe over fraud allegations in Innovate Dynamics IPO. The article was a masterpiece of controlled demolition. It quoted anonymous sources. Marcus had done his work well, and laid out the accounting fraud in meticulous, undeniable detail. It was a kill shot. When Richard came home that evening, he was a broken man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a gray, hollowed-out exhaustion. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me. He walked past me as if I wasn't there, went into his study, and closed the door. I could hear the sound of a glass breaking a few minutes later, followed by a choked, guttural sob. I felt nothing. No joy, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, empty sense of a task completed. This was not about emotion anymore. This was a mathematical equation. He was a problem, and I was solving it. The fallout was swift and brutal. The IPO was dead on arrival. Investors pulled out. The board of Sterling Ventures, the very men who had slapped Richard on the back for years, forced him to step down as CEO. His name, once a symbol of success and power, was now synonymous with fraud, but I wasn't finished. His financial ruin was only part of the equation. I wanted to take away everything he had used to define himself. His reputation was in tatters. His company was gone. The last pillar was his social standing, his belief that, no matter what, he was admired and respected. This part of the plan was more subtle. It was a campaign of whispers. I used the network I had cultivated for years, the quiet, observant wives he had always dismissed. I never made a direct accusation. I simply planted seeds of doubt. At a charity luncheon, I would let it slip to a notorious gossip that I was so worried about Richard. He's been so erratic lately. The stress must be getting to him. To another, I would confide, with feigned reluctance, that his drinking had become a bit of a concern. I would mention canceled appointments, forgotten promises, small, believable cracks in the facade of the great man. The rumors spread like a virus. Combined with the public disgrace of the SEC investigation, it was enough. The invitations to dinners and galas stopped coming. When we did venture out, people were polite but distant. Old friends would suddenly find someone else they needed to talk to when he approached. He was a pariah, a social leper. The final act took place in our silent marble mausoleum of a house. It was about a month after the story broke. He had been drinking heavily, a ghost rattling around in the empty rooms. I found him in the living room, staring out the window, the ever-present glass of scotch in his hand. "They all hate me," he said, his voice thick and slurred. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "People are disappointed, Richard," I said, my voice neutral. He turned to look at me, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a desperate, pleading confusion. "Why, Jessica? Why is this happening?" This was the moment, the culmination of everything, the final killing blow. "It's happening, Richard," I said, walking slowly towards him. "Because I made it happen." He stared at me, his brow furrowed, not comprehending. The phone call to Arthur. The package to Marcus Thorne. The whispers, the rumors, all of it. That was me. The color drained from his face. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. The agreeable, decorative wife was gone. In her place was a stranger, a creature of cold, calculating vengeance. You, he breathed, the word catching in his throat. You did this? To me? No, Richard, I said, stopping just a few feet from him. I did this for me. You declared me irrelevant. You tried to erase me. You thought I was just another one of your assets, a thing you owned. You were wrong. I was your partner. And when you broke that partnership, you turned me into your enemy, and I am a much better enemy than you ever deserved. He just shook his head, a gesture of pure, uncomprehending defeat. The great Richard Sterling, the master of the universe, was finally and completely broken. He had nothing left. No company, no friends, no wife, just an empty mansion and a bottle of scotch. He looked so small, so pathetic. The king was dethroned, and he didn't even understand the coup that had taken place. He never saw me, not really, and that was his fatal mistake. I turned and walked away, leaving him there in the gathering twilight. I went upstairs, packed a single bag, and walked out of that house without looking back. So here I am. In a small, anonymous apartment overlooking the city. My old life is gone. The money, the mansion, the social status, all of it. I gave it all up to watch him fall. And now, the question that lingers in the quiet hours of the night. The question you're probably asking. Was it worth it? The victory was not sweet. It was not triumphant. It was empty. There was a brief, sharp thrill in seeing justice done, in seeing a man who believed he was above consequences finally face them. But it was fleeting. The fire of my rage burned so brightly that it consumed everything, including the woman I used to be. I destroyed him. I took away everything he valued. But in doing so, I had to become a monster. I had to be as ruthless, as manipulative, as cruel as he was. I won the war, but I look at my hands and I don't recognize them. I look in the mirror and I see the cold, calculating strategist I had to become. Revenge is not a dish best served cold. It's a poison you drink yourself, hoping the other person dies. It worked. He's dead in every way that matters to him. But I'm left with the aftertaste. I'm free of him, but I'm not sure if I'm free of what I did to him. He made me a widow to the man I once loved, but I made myself a ghost, destined to haunt the ruins of a life I meticulously destroyed. Was it worth it? Ask me again tomorrow. And there it is. The complete demolition of a life, executed with surgical precision. But as we see, the victory wasn't sweet. It was a poison the victor had to drink themselves, leaving them a ghost in the ruins of a life they meticulously destroyed. Thank you so much for sticking with us through that intense journey. Now I have to ask you, what did you think? Was Jessica's revenge justified? Or did she become the very monster she sought to destroy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please hit that like button. For more deep dives into the anatomy of human drama, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. The best way to support the channel right now is by sharing this video with anyone you think would be captivated by it. Until next time, remember that the quietest people are often the most observant. Take care.